during the Okay, so I'm just going to jump right into this and get started. I'm going to, just because it's a little long presentation and it jumps around a little bit, just a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about sort of the history of the problem, who is affected, where sort of there's a big geographic component. And then I'm going to have a section where I'm going to talk a lot about cars. So I just want you to be prepared for that. And then finally, sort of solutions and what we could do about this issue. So, this is I use as an example a street where I live in Cleveland, Euclid Avenue. It's sort of like our main street in our downtown. And here's a photo from 1930. And I just want to point out a couple things about the photo. You can see at this time there are a few cars. Sort of cars have started arriving in cities just right around this time, but people are still pretty dependent on streetcars. You can see, we were a streetcar city originally, and we've got a lot of pedestrians. And one thing I just want to point out is, sort of how relaxed people look crossing the street. At this time, there would not have been any crosswalks. Pedestrians had free roam of the streets. And there was actually a lot of different varied activities that took place in the streets at this time. It was, like a public space that was really well used. One example is children played in streets. That you can see here, there's even a little carnival. This is not Cleveland's, but a little picture I found, a little carnival game pulled up. There are also, merchants would sell things in streets. People would pause and talk. So, but there was a big shift around this period. When, like I mentioned, by 1930, cars had started to enter cities in a little bit. And then there was the invention of the Model T Ford, and they started to become a lot cheaper, and that's when we started to see sort of mass adoption of cars in the United States. So there was a major change to the way we conceptualize and think about streets at this time. And a lot of what happened when that occurred was that a lot of people started getting killed, especially children. All of a sudden, thousands of people started dying, were being hit by cars and dying, drivers. And at the time, drivers were relatively high income. It was a lot of sort of auto enthusiasts and that kind of thing. You didn't really need a car at this time to accomplish sort of your daily needs. So there was a lot of anger about this and quite a bit of backlash, actually. And there was groups like the National Safety Council, a lot of mothers who'd lost children that were organizing and pushing back against sort of the encroachment of cars in cities, and trying to sort of maybe limit where they could travel, limit how fast they could travel. So in response, a group of auto-related interests got organized, and I'm sort of borrowing from some research that was done here by this University of Virginia historian named Peter Norton, who wrote a book about this whole period and this struggle. But to counter these upset mothers whose children were being killed and who were calling for reforms around street safety, we had this group, and he calls them motordom, but it was basically like auto dealers, gas sellers, and then automobile clubs that was enthusiasts. So they say they sort of joined together to fight for their interests. And one of their big victories was the introduction of this concept of jaywalking. So prior to this time, there was no, pedestrians sort of could walk wherever, and that was normal and accepted. And they introduced this idea that pedestrians should only be able to cross the street at certain locations, and even then only when there was basically no traffic, when sort of the light allowed it. So they use this kind of propaganda. This is again a historical record from Peter Norton that he dug up in 1952 in Cincinnati. They would have like Boy Scouts distribute this kind of pamphlets on the streets, and you can see like the language, very victim blaming. They're sort of, when someone's killed, the big question is, whose fault is it when someone's killed by a car? And a lot of these mothers, said it's the drivers. They're reckless, they're speeding. And these guys said, no, it's the fault of the pedestrians. They're in the wrong place. They're not doing what they should be doing. And this concept at the time, the term J was a very derogatory term. It would be like today's sort of calling someone like a hillbilly or something, to call someone a J. So they use this derogatory term to try to brand folks who cross the street outside of, the intersections as being sort of stupid or unsophisticated and sort of deserving of what came to them if they got hit or killed. So that eventually was adopted by the federal government and now is sort of the rule everywhere. Although there has been some progress, maybe I'll return to this. Since I started working on this book and doing this presentation, there actually have been a couple areas that have backed away from this, but for the purposes of this presentation, obviously now jaywalking is very foundational to the way we think about who belongs in streets and what they're for. And so you can see the transformation that took place in Cleveland. This is just 16 years after the first photo I showed. And this is, I should point out, a different street. But you can see how all of a sudden there, the earlier picture, there's so many people. And by 1946, introduction of the Model T Ford, introduction of these jaywalking laws, in a lot of cases, the streetcars are being torn up. So all of a sudden, we have this big change, and there's no people visible at all anymore in this photo, and the whole right-of-way is dominated then by cars. So that's pretty much been the status quo for a long time, and it's led to this situation where pedestrians are really marginalized, where any misstep can be fatal for them. So like earlier when I was introducing the book, I talked about the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States. That was sort of what the book was about. And this is the pattern I'm talking about here. So if we go back about a decade, since then we've seen about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths. So this is actually really unusual in traffic safety. For the most part, since the 1970s, we've had less fatalities over time because we've introduced things like seat belts and airbags and that kind of thing. But so when this started occurring, like in the early part of the last decade, a lot of people were sort of mystified by this and thought it was just a fluke. But now we know this is this sort of sustained pattern and trend. And it has kept up even during Corona, where we had so many people working from home and driving less miles. We've still seen the same kind of pattern, disappointingly. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about who's getting killed. Okay. So I covered sort of the history and background. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions sort of about this in the media. There's the jaywalking, sort of the victim blaming is sort of our default response to when someone is hit by a car, especially someone who's walking or biking in the United States. So I think, some of the media treatments of this problem have been really bad and prevent us from resolving it or having the will to resolve it. So one of the stereotypes I think about this is when people think of, okay, sort of who's getting killed while they're walking, the kind of person they picture maybe is this guy sort of here on the left, and he's like a very wired millennial, and he's crossing in a crosswalk, maybe in a major city like DC. But the reality is it's more like this guy sort of here on the right who, maybe is low income and is just trying to operate in an environment that's really unsafe in a lot of cases. So I think this is a little bit informed by some of the privilege of the folks that are in positions of influence, like a media columnist, for example, in a major city. This guy on the left might be what he sees anecdotally on his drive to work. So that's the way he thinks of, pedestrians. This guy slowed him down and annoyed him. And he's just not put in this position of this guy on the right who just sort of having to run for his life to get what he needs. Okay, so this is
jump in real fast.
Yeah.
I just wanted to sort of take a second to circle this back around for our students, just so you guys are very clear on why this is important to you. We are not specifically talking about people who are blind and visually impaired here, of course, but just keep in mind, most of the people that you work with are non-drivers, either because they can't be drivers or they can only drive under certain circumstances, or they have big requirements in order to drive, such as bioptic driving. But for most of the people we work with, this isn't an option. So they are largely forced to be pedestrians. So anything that affects pedestrians has a huge impact on the people we work with. So thanks, go let me interrupt.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to talk a little bit about who's being killed, and actually in the book, I talk a little bit about people with disabilities, people who use wheelchairs. But I actually didn't focus a lot on people with vision issues, although absolutely, yes, they would be affected by this more than the average person. And a lot of times, this issue, people who are disadvantaged in one way or in multiple ways, sort of socially, are at higher risk to be hurt or killed this way. Which I think, is a pattern in a lot of public health problems, of course. But this is one. So I was just going to talk real briefly. Systemic racism plays a role in this. Black people are almost twice as likely to be killed while walking. Hispanic folks are at increased risk, and Native folks are almost 5 times as likely to be killed this way. Another group that's disproportionately harmed is older folks. People who are 75 and above are about twice as likely to be killed while walking, and the risk increases once people turn 50. So it starts younger than you would think. One thing I wanted to say about this is, or one thing I always say is, this is not a group we do a very good job planning for. We're sort of, in urban planning, which is the field I come from, the focus, or in traffic engineering, even more so, the sort of, I think the sort of like default identity in people's mind of who they're planning for is like a middle-aged man who's like a worker, somebody who they see as really serving the economy, maybe commuting on the highway by car. So they're really focused on serving that population. And, people who are retired or parents of young children just have not been the focus of a lot of transportation planning efforts. And that puts people who don't fall into that profile of like the middle-aged man at risk, or it can. So again, elderly people, people of color, people who use wheelchairs, again, there's evidence that they're at increased risk. And then people who have, their identity is intersectional for more than one of those things, would be even at higher risk potentially. One thing I want to point out about this is, this is a population, the United States is aging very rapidly. This is a fast growing population. So the growth in older people have always been more vulnerable to these kind of collisions for a lot of reasons that I think are fairly obvious. But the growth in this population can in part explain why we're seeing growth in these kind of deaths. Okay, so that's just a little bit about who's being killed. And yeah, if you want to jump in at any point and help contextualize this, please feel free. I have no problem with that. So I talked a little bit about who is being killed. Now I want to talk a little bit about where is being killed, because this is something that has a really strong geographic component. So this is a map that shows the most dangerous states for walking. And the most dangerous states are these states down here in purple, Delaware up here, and the safest are these green states. So this is a pretty small group. Like, does anyone want to just hop in and make an observation about, which states are more dangerous? And does anyone have any guesses about why that might be?
I'll jump in. So I'm noticing it's mostly northern. And the first thing I think about for that is weather conditions. I don't know if that would have anything to do with it. And then
I'm sorry. This map is confusing. It's actually the green. It's actually the green that are the safest. So it's sorry, it's confusing. This is not my map.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Well then,
I'm glad. I'm glad we talked so that we can straighten it out.
Yeah.
So.
Then I would say probably the South, just because it's better weather, so more people are inclined to walk or commute that way, maybe.
Yeah, you're right. The southeast is the most dangerous. And actually, the reason if we go back, like, have you guys ever traveled to Florida and noticed like how wide the roads are there? For example, Florida's the most dangerous state in the United States. Actually, it goes back to the history I talked about at the beginning. Like some of these places, like a Boston, is a very old city, right? And so it developed a lot before cars became the dominant mode of transportation. You know, they have a lot of buildings and streets that are sort of narrow, and they were built around streetcars and sort of more walking type of city compared to places in South Florida that didn't really develop as urban places very much until after 1940, until after the invention of air conditioning. These places are really built more around cars, more around their neighborhoods have a more suburban form, right? So they might not have as many walking destinations, and then they have a lot of very wide dangerous roads in the southeast. So that's sort of the explanation for that. And it is unfortunate because they do have, in some cases, good weather for walking, but also a lot of extreme heat now as well.
Angie, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So like, as I'm looking at the states that are green and, are sort of the safest places for walking, I'm glad that my hunch about why the Northeast would be that way was on target, because those, having lived in some parts of the Northeast, it is very much more pedestrian friendly.
Yeah.
But I'm like seeing these states like sort of in the, the Midwest and sort of the upper Midwest, like Wyoming, Nebraska, North Dakota. Is that just because people don't walk because there's such expansive areas
probably
nobody would walk?
This is like an analysis done by Smart Growth America, and they tried to look at different, they tried to suss out how many people were walking and include that in that.
Okay.
Like they use the number. So there may be something weird is going on there, but yeah, there's not a lot of people walking there. The safer places are, you're right, sort of in the Northeast and the older places. And Minnesota actually is Minneapolis is pretty on the forefront with biking and walking issues, are sort of a little Portland-esque. So that would explain that. Wyoming and Nebraska, yeah.
I used to live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I actually almost never drove because my policy was unless it's below 30 degrees, which actually is most of the winter, but I won't drive because I was in Lincoln and we had beautiful bike paths. I could get from one end of the town to the other in 20 minutes. So
it's probably true too that these are, probably older cities too in some of those areas, like I don't know, actually. Lincoln, that's a good example. Some of those cities would be similar to Cleveland, I would think, in Iowa too, where they had, like where I live in Cleveland, and Pittsburgh is actually sort of a big walking city. It's sort of about 10% of workers in Pittsburgh walk to work, which is kind of pretty unusual, especially for a city that isn't on the East Coast. So Pittsburgh's sort of an interesting example.
So I interrupt. I just thought it was interesting because those are two very different parts of the country.
I know. And having a small, it looks like we're like going down a rabbit hole, but it looks like having a small population, a small state population might, in their analysis, might skew things a little bit to me. But we know very clearly that Texas, Florida, Georgia, like Texas has about, I believe it's about 600 people are killed walking every year in Texas. And Florida, again, is terrible. So there really is this pattern where newer places tend to be more hostile. But that has changed a little bit in recent years because there's more, hype about walkable places and sort of urban living. Anyway, sorry. So this has a geographic component too that's relevant, that at a smaller scale to what's happening in the metro area. So again, I'm using Cleveland as an example here. And this is a map that shows racial segregation in Cleveland, because I mentioned this is an issue that's related to systemic racism in some ways, and that people of color are at higher risk to be hurt or killed this way. So as you can see, this is 1990 in Cleveland. I'm just using it as an example. What I'm going to be talking about is relevant pretty much to any metro area. So you can see very segregated. We're very segregated. This is green shows concentrations of where Black people live. Orange is where there's like homogenous, white people, suburbs type rural areas. And then the yellow shows areas that are a little more diverse. So I just want to, we don't have the latest census data yet, but I just want to, like, if we go from 1990 to 2010, you can see we're still really segregated, but that there has been this sort of outward migration and that our suburbs are becoming more diverse, sort of out here and down here and over here. And that's, again, that is a national trend. Sometimes you hear, there's also, in addition to there being more racial diversity in the suburbs, there's more economic diversity now. So the suburbs are a little bit like I talked about earlier, like Sunbelt places where they developed later. Usually they weren't, we didn't have streetcars going way out here in Cleveland in 1935. These places were places people migrated to after they bought their 2 cars. And so they, again, the suburbs tend to be more dangerous. So now we have more, we hear this talk a little bit about the suburbanization of poverty in the United States, which is this big, again, meta trend. But I don't think we really, I don't know, to me, the maps just like this. And again, if we had the 2020 data, I think it would be even more pronounced. And it is more pronounced for some growing metro areas too. Cleveland is sort of a slow growth area. So there's been even faster change in some fast growing places like Atlanta over the last few decades. So again, that's putting people who, may lack a car out in more dangerous places, as is migration to the Sun Belt, which is, again, a long-standing trend. So we have a couple things going on, just to reiterate and try to tie this together. We have, a population that's aging and is a little bit more vulnerable. And we also have them sort of out in locations that are more dangerous, either living in Sunbelt cities like Houston or Miami, or B, living in suburban areas of their metro area. And in areas that have gentrification happening as well, that can really put people who have affordability issues with cars, or disabled people who often are lower income, sort of out of reach of good transit service and walkable neighborhoods. Okay, so and getting back to this issue of racism and structural racism and how that plays in. So again, we've seen this map again of Cleveland, racial segregation. Here's a map of our most dangerous corridors in Cleveland, and you can see how they match up almost exactly with where Black and Hispanic folks are concentrated. That's, again, sort of something that we would see quite commonly in any metro area, and may go back to specific policies like redlining. Okay. So again, if anyone wants to hop in, that's totally fine with me. But I want to talk a little bit more about this issue because sort of this issue of geographic inequality plays a role. And that's a little bit what I'm talking about. So it's not just, one thing that's going on as well is that Black and brown neighborhoods are being passed over for the kind of safety infrastructure that would protect them. And in this example, I'm using Portland instead of Cleveland. And this is a map that shows all the traffic fatalities that happened in Portland over a 2-year period. In Portland, they have more people killed in traffic every year than murdered. So just to put the numbers in perspective. But they've done a lot in Portland to try to address it. They're sort of famous for their bike infrastructure. But as you can see, these deaths aren't happening, sort of randomly. There's a clear concentration over on this right-hand side of the map. So what's going on there? Okay, so in Portland, probably not that many people in this audience are that familiar with Portland, but in Portland, there's this big sort of socio-economic dividing line right here, East 82nd Street, which is the start of everything east of there is called East Portland. And without getting into too much detail, I just want to say it's a little lower income and more diverse than the rest of the city. So Portland made this map that shows the 30 most high crash intersections in Portland. And they're shown here. 28 out of 30 are in East Portland. Only a quarter of the city's population lives in East Portland, but it represents about half the city's traffic deaths. So again, just to tie it into a little bit, this issue of there's racism in how we're sort of deploying safety amenities, you know, in our government bodies and that kind of thing. Here's just an example I like to use. And I talked a little bit earlier in the presentation how Native Americans, Native folks are at almost 5 times the risk for being killed while walking. And so I don't think we fully understand the reasons for that, but one reason seems to be that people who live on reservations or tribal lands, those tend to be in rural areas, but they function a little bit like a traditional village where there's a good amount of walking, right? So this is an example. There was a really interesting study done by some folks at the University of Minnesota, and they went out and they interviewed a bunch of folks that lived on reservations or visited them, tribal elders and that kind of thing, about their concerns, their transportation related concerns. And people were saying, you know, almost everyone interviewed brought this up as a top concern, pedestrian safety. But then they went and talked to the people at the State Department of Transportation and they interviewed them, and there was a big disconnect. Those guys almost never brought up pedestrian safety. And if they did, they tended to use sort of victim blamey type explanations about drunk walking and that type of thing. So anyway, you can see here, this is just an example of the kind of conditions those folks might be dealing with. You know, we have this really high speed rural highway. There's on one side of this road, there's a tribal service center, and on the other side, there's a food cellar. And you can see people have just worn paths in the dirt, but they don't have a crosswalk, they don't have a light, they're having to cross, you know, these very high speed roads. So I think, you know, the reason I use this example is just to point out that there are often, for the officials that have responsibility for safety, there isn't enough sort of respect for local knowledge, especially when it comes to different cultures. And our engineering professionals and planning professionals are often not representative, you know, very white. And in the case of engineering, almost exclusively male. And so, are not doing a good job serving diverse populations always. Okay, so I talked about the history of this problem, who's getting killed, where. So there's this other factor. Like I talked about, there's more people who are more vulnerable and they're in these locations that are more dangerous. And then at the same time, we have this really big change in our vehicle mix in the United States and what kind of cars people are driving. And I think this has happened so quickly, it's sort of took everyone by surprise. But over the last decade, there's been this enormous growth in SUVs and crossovers. So if we go back to like the early part of the last decade, almost 3/4 of new cars sold were sedans. Do you guys know what I mean by a sedan? Like a Honda Civic? Yeah, okay. So there's been this big reversal, and now about 3/4 of new cars sold are either SUVs or pickup trucks. And sedans are sort of they've gone out of style, and a lot of car companies aren't even making them anymore. So just to take a look, so we're sort of trading this car. This is just a random picture I took, but just to compare the size of these two cars, we've sort of traded this car over here on the right for this car over here on the left. And these are cars that really have very similar sort of carrying capacity. They seat the same number of people. There might be a little more cargo room, right, in this white car, but I just want to notice how much bigger that car on the left is, the SUV version. So this turns out to have a really big impact on pedestrian safety. I'm just using myself, and I'm about 5'6" as just for scale here. But you can see, like, if I was struck by a Honda Civic here on the left, it would hit me sort of like in the legs. And then I might fall. What would happen is I'd fall into the hood, and it's not good. It's not good to get hit by a Honda Civic. But if I was hit by, this is a Toyota 4Runner over here on the right, you can see it would hit me sort of like right in the chest and the abdomen. So sort of like right in my internal organs. And then some of these are so tall that I might be, instead of forced up onto the hood, I might be pushed down under the wheels and run over. So there's some pretty compelling data that it's much more dangerous for pedestrians to be struck by an SUV than a car. And that's just to sort of explain why. But some statistics from the Federal Highway Administration say that people who are struck by an SUV compared to a sedan are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed. So, and the other thing is I use this photo in all my presentations. This is my son when he was 4 years old in front of a lifted Ford F-250. Another thing that's happening is pickup trucks have just gotten really, really enormous. They have huge, they also produce these big blind zones around the front and the back. So, the driver of this car, my son who's 4 would be obviously be entirely invisible to the driver. And there's people that have done experiments where they're actually able to sit like 20 or 30 kids in the blind zone of some of these bigger vehicles. Like the blind zone is as large as 10 feet from some of these bigger trucks and SUVs. And there are also big issues with rear blind zones. It's sort of horrifying actually how often children especially are backed over. It happens about 50 times a week in the United States, and almost every case, they're backed over by a parent or close relative in their own driveway. So these visibility issues are also a problem. So anyway, cars are getting more dangerous, bottom line. So I just want to walk you through, because I think like this happened, I don't know, sort of slowly, and it's sort of hard to notice. But it's really striking how car design has changed in like the last 10 years, so or longer. So this is a RAV4, as I like to use it as an example. And this the 1996 version. It was like the first crossover SUV. And you can see how cute and little it is. It was actually it was a Toyota Corolla, basically, with like a little bit of a taller hood, and a little bit of a different underbody. But you can see it has like a really cute, smiling, kind of nice face. And the reason I use this car as an example is because it's the #1 selling vehicle in the United States outside of pickup trucks. So just to walk you through the evolution a little bit. So there it is in 2006 or 1996. It weighs as little as 2,500 pounds. That was a 2-door model, by the way. So you can see by 2009 just how much bigger it's gotten, and how like the face of the vehicle is a little bit like more sinister looking compared to like the friendly 1996 one. And then by 2019, we're more than 1,000 pounds heavier on the light ends, and much meaner, sort of scowling face. This is really what's in style now with cars, like a sort of a tall, large grille, and sort of a mean, scowling, high riding vehicle. And there's some really sort of disturbing research that shows that car companies there's actually this sort of impulse people have. They want to potentially be able to run people over with their cars if they feel threatened. And so car companies have really seized on that and profited on it to a sort of a gross degree. And they make a lot of money on it. Like, a RAV4 will sell for 10 to 15,000 more dollars than a Corolla. Or typically, car companies can sell an SUV version of a car for $10,000 to $15,000 more than the sedan, even though they cost about the same amount of money to build. So this trend has been really, really profitable for automakers, especially American automakers. But there has been this some sort of disturbing safety fallout from it. Okay, I'm sort of wrapping up and getting to the portion where I talk about, because I know this is a bummer. So where I talk about potential solutions. So, but I did want to just real quickly, another issue is large vehicles. This image shows the blind spots around or I should say, I'm sorry, I'm trying to use less ableist language, but I don't have a good substitute. But these are the areas that would not be visible to the driver of this truck. So, in a city that, it can create some problems on a highway, but in an urban environment where a lot of people are killed by heavy trucks, this is really dangerous. And we just sort of allow trucks with these kind of visibility shortcomings to drive into all of our major cities, even though almost all of this could be resolved using some additional equipment, some mirrors and cameras. We just sort of don't require it. And quite often, pedestrians and cyclists are killed in cities by truck drivers that never saw them. Okay.
Can we jump in with a couple of questions? I'm seeing that a couple of students have posted a question sort of on this topic. Is that okay if we sort of jump in?
Yeah, of course.
And then I also had a follow-up question with their question. So Lindsay had typed in the chat box, has there been a decrease in backing into children or a decrease since the installation of like cameras and alerts?
Yes. Excellent question. Yes. Very good question. Just a few years ago, the federal government, there's an agency called NHTSA. It's like a long acronym.
Everyone should be familiar with NHTSA if you're in the O&M program, folks. If you're not, look it up.
Okay, yeah. So they're the agency, the federal agency that's responsible for auto safety. So, the kind of people that required seatbelts and airbags and anti-lock brakes. But they always have to be really, really pushed. So just a couple of years ago, finally, they did require backup cameras. So I would expect, it takes a long time for the vehicle fleet to entirely turn over. But I would expect, yes, those back over collisions to drop and then eventually maybe be almost eliminated. So it really shows sort of the power of vehicle regulations. But it's actually, safety advocates would say it's really sort of an outrage that they weren't required sooner, maybe. The auto companies always want to argue against the safety requirements potentially for money saving. But there's a lot of features like that. Again, there's a lot of safety issues that could be resolved with different kinds of vehicle technology that we just haven't required.
The follow-up question I sort of wanted to throw out there is relate, and you might already have a plan to talk about this. So if I'm getting ahead of this, just tell me to hold on. But like another big change in cars that's been really applicable to individuals who are blind and visually impaired is the whole quiet car issue. Cars that are elect, for anybody who is not familiar with what that means. So cars that are hybrid and electric are much quieter than cars with a traditional internal combustion engine. Even those cars that do have a traditional internal combustion engine are much quieter than they used to be when they run. For those of you who have not had this content yet, instead of hearing the motor of the car, what you typically hear in hybrid and electric cars is the sound of the tire tread against the road. But the problem is, if the car is traveling below 20 miles per hour, that doesn't generate much noise at all. And most of the time when the individuals we work with are impacted with something like this, it's in an intersection where the cars are traveling less than 20 miles per hour. So there's not much noise. And we do teach people primarily to focus on auditory cues for street crossings and things like that. So I just wonder, does this have a bigger impact on other communities, or is this really more of a specific to our disability area? I mean, I think about like kids on bikes and people with mobility issues who might not hear them.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that people with low vision are the group that's most impacted. I just heard a story yesterday about a woman who said she really had to reduce the amount of walking and the amount of leaving her house she could do outside of a lift because of that. But I'm actually not super knowledgeable about that. I could probably learn a little bit from you all, sort of about that. I know that the vehicles can emit sounds potentially, but then of course, the noise pollution for is just something to consider on the other side too. The noise pollution for people who live. I don't know.
I, I I could throw in there that as parent, and I've had this come up with other parents just in talking to our kids about, when they're crossing the street, my street happens to be a little bit busier than I would like, and some people really don't care what speed they go down at, that you can't always hear the vehicles like you used to because they make a lot less noise. And so we're bringing that up to our kids. So I imagine it affects other people too, whether or not they have, issues with vision.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the new technologies, these new technologies offer a lot of promise, but they can also present risks too. So I'm actually not sure how that is going to be handled, or even what is the best way to handle it. I'm sorry, I don't know, but
Maybe something like the backup beeping required for some vehicles. I think it's required anyway. I'm really not sure if it's required or.
yeah, I know that is an option for them to emit a noise, but I don't think, I don't think that's happening right now.
Yeah, I'm fairly up on the research surrounding, sounds that can and should be added. But I just, I'm not sure what the impact is on other communities. I mean, like, I know that I would just think this, like what you were saying, Don, I think that's a great point. I think this has to impact like kids when they're out playing, or out riding bikes and stuff like that. Because you do use your auditory information to sort of alert you.
Mhm.
Anyway, just one more thing I wanted to bring up since it has to do with the evolution of our cars.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. I should be more up on it. Um, okay. So anyways, I just want to talk a little bit at the end of this presentation about some things that different places are doing that can help, or some promising sort of strategies to address this. So this is an example of something that's called a road diet, sort of commonly in urban planning. This is Queens Boulevard in New York City, and it's what we call a suburban arterial. And that just means it's a wide road with multiple lanes. And in this case, it runs through a very densely populated area that has a lot of destinations, including a lot of housing, a lot of retail. The kind of these are the kind of streets where there's a lot of car traffic, but people are also wanting to access these destinations on foot, the most dangerous kind of streets. So 198 people were killed on this road between like 1996 and 2014. So it's the kind of road where they're having as many as 10 deaths or more a year. And that's actually, they called it the Boulevard of Death in New York. I think it was their most dangerous road. It's actually not that uncommon in cities for just a handful of streets to account for like a wildly disproportionate share of deaths, which is upsetting, but also an opportunity because then you can focus on fixing them and have a big impact. So this is in 2014, I believe it was. The New York City they did a road diet, they call this. So they took one of the lanes, they put these bollards. This was a relatively inexpensive project. They only spent $12 million, which is by infrastructure standards quite cheap. They painted it, they made this one into a bike lane, and they also took another lane on the right-hand side and painted it red and turned it into a bus lane. And after they did that, deaths fell off a cliff. It was several years. They're going from having 6, 10, 12 deaths a year on this road to having several years where they have 0. So that can be a really effective strategy. We have to be thinking about, the way we design infrastructure. Are we prioritizing speed, or are we prioritizing safety? And there's really a lot of benefits for multiple different groups to prioritizing safety a little bit more. This gives people a chance to be active. You can see people are using it both to walk. They actually, I guess they created, oh, that's interesting. I'm just noticing they created a sidewalk and a bike lane with different colors of paint on the road. So New York's the real leader on this. In 2018, they have this strategy called Vision Zero. Is anyone familiar with that? Have you guys heard of that? So basically it's this idea that was imported from Sweden. And, you know, in the United States, we have about 35 to 40,000 traffic deaths every year. And everyone's sort of used to it. You know, we sort of expect a lot of people are going to die every year. And our goals, our agency goals like NHTSA might set a goal to do 5% better next year. So we're sort of planning and hoping for 32 to 35,000 deaths a year. But in Sweden, about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, they had this engineer, and he said, "Look, we as planners, we as engineers, we can't plan for any deaths. It's not acceptable for there to be any traffic deaths. We need to be designing sort of serious injury and death out of our public right of ways." And so, you know, cities like cities in Western or countries in Western Europe, like Sweden and Norway, have traffic death rates that are about a quarter to a fifth of ours on a population adjusted basis. So far fewer people die in those countries that are real world leaders on traffic safety compared to us in the United States. But anyway, a lot of US cities now have Vision Zero policies, including Pittsburgh. I know that they're doing some interesting stuff there and trying to address this, again, in low cost ways, a little bit like New York. In 2018, so New York has a Vision Zero plan. They're trying to eliminate deaths and serious injuries on their traffic deaths and serious injuries on their roads. And in 2018, they had the lowest number of traffic deaths in New York City for 100 years. So they've made some progress since cars came on the scene, and those original pictures I showed you and started killing people. New York got down to a level that they had not seen for generations. And here's a couple of the strategies that they used. One thing that's really effective is just retiming traffic signals. So they call that a leading pedestrian interval. And what that means is when pedestrians get the walk signal and they're standing there waiting to cross, they get, before the cars who are turning get their sort of go ahead to start turning and crossing the intersection, pedestrians have a few seconds head start where it's just them. The signal phase is just them giving them the walk signal. So then they can be out sort of the idea is they're out sort of in the middle of the intersection there when people start making these left turns that can be very dangerous. Left turns are a really risky thing. Drivers have these blind spots from the pillars in their cars. So that is really effective. In addition, and it's really inexpensive. It doesn't require a lot of equipment to retime traffic signals. It just requires a little bit of political will and sorry. I'm a writer, so I get caught up trying to think of the perfect word sometimes, and I just can't get that one. But they also did this thing right here, moving on, they also did this thing called a hardened center line. So all that means really is that they put something in the middle of the intersection. In this case, they just use plastic bollards. Again, what that does is it forces, you know how sometimes when cars are making a left turn, they're going really fast, they make this wide, they make this sort of wide turn where they might cut across the lanes over here. This sort of forces them to make a sharper, slower left turn. Basically, that's it. But the combination of these two things, a leading pedestrian interval and this hardened center line, helps reduce pedestrian fatalities 35 to 40%. And they've done it at thousands of intersections across New York City. And it can be done for, it costs them I believe it's about $2,500 per intersection to do this. So again, relatively cheap, big bang, safety bang for the buck from New York. Okay.
Hey, can I jump in with a quick question about that?
Yeah.
And I want to sort of have any students, especially those of you who've had the Advanced Cane Techniques 2 class, sort of think this through a little bit. So this extended time for the pedestrian to start walking before the cars start moving. What is the implicit issue that our individuals who are totally blind are going to run into with that? I just want to make sure they're thinking through this in terms of our specific content knowledge as well. What is missing if the pedestrian is supposed to start walking a couple of seconds before the cars start moving?
The traffic surge?
Yeah, so they're not getting the surge. So one of the problems that we have to teach our folks about is, even though this is a safety enhancement, our individuals aren't going to be able to start moving during that extended time that pedestrians are given, because they aren't going to get their traffic searched. So our population that we're focusing on are really going to still be crossing at that traditional time after the car starts moving. So they're not able to necessarily take advantage of that. So just bringing in some specifics to make sure those stay at the front of our minds too.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, because if you're crossing auditorily, you have to wait for the traffic to surge so that
What
you know
about
it's
this-
okay to cross.
Unless they have an audible.
If there's an audible pedestrian signal, yeah, but at the same time, we still want to be listening to traffic, because since you can't visually make sure people are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's pretty chancy.
There were some locations, like when I was in Pittsburgh recently, like I said, we got like an Airbnb and went to Pittsburgh there was a couple of locations where they had something called a pedestrian scramble. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, I'm on the Oakland action planning team for the area around University of Pittsburgh's campus.
Yes, it
And,
was where I saw it, yeah.
Yeah, we did some, we've been doing some walking tours related to some of their planning that they're doing right now. And I'm the one that's always there screaming, no, this isn't acceptable.
Yeah.
So I hate those. Those intersections drive me insane. We hate those, but
You hate pedestrian scrambles. Interesting.
they're awful for our clients. They're trying to do things auditorily. It's an absolute nightmare. They're completely unsafe.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah.
That's
So
interesting.
I'm begging them not to do anymore.
Interesting. Okay.
What is a pedestrian scramble? Is that when you can cross like all four
Yeah,
ways?
so that's when no cars pedestrians have the full phase. So all the cars
Okay.
are stopped and pedestrians can go whichever way they want.
Okay.
But even if it was audible, it wouldn't work for people because without the traffic noise.
If it's audible, it's okay, except not all of them around here are audible. And so there's just dead silence and there's no
Yeah.
cue to give people anything. And one of the other problems that happens is whenever you're walking and you're doing this auditorily, it's very easy to veer. And what you're usually doing is you're listening to your parallel traffic as it's moving through the intersection, and you're making these little micro corrections to keep yourself from veering out into the intersection or veering into traffic. And without any auditory sounds to follow to make sure you're traveling in a straight line, it's not uncommon to veer, and then you can suddenly find yourself in the middle of an intersection and there's no tactile cue to help you figure out where you are.
Gotcha. Sorry, I'm learning a lot from this too.
I love the
It's
discussion.
embarrassing that I don't. But yeah, sorry. So streetlights are another important issue around this. I don't know, is this relevant? Should I skip this, or would this be really relevant for you guys? For this kind of content, talking about streetlights?
Oh yeah, streetlights are really important to us.
Yeah, I would think it would matter to people with low vision.
Mhm.
So that's an issue so streetlights, I think, are sort of underappreciated sort of safety feature in cities, and they're great because they can improve both traffic safety and personal safety, right? People who have concerns about crime. This is beneficial for them as well. So anyway, does anyone recognize these cities and want to chime in and want to chime in and take a guess? This is taken from space. It's a satellite image at night.
Is one Chicago?
No, good guess though.
New York City.
All right, I just it's actually Detroit right here, and Cleveland where I live down here, and that's Toledo. But one thing I want to point out about this is you can see I just wanted to point out how Detroit looks a little bit bluer up here compared to Cleveland. It's like a more orange hue. So that's actually a big success story. And again, I think this is a little bit of an overlooked issue. And I think it comes back a little bit to privilege in some ways. But so the story is, it's a success story, I said. And around 2011, 2012, Detroit did a survey of all of its streetlights, and it found out that about 40% weren't working. You know, they had been in bankruptcy a few years earlier, so they were broken, not functioning for whatever reason. And they decided to do something about it. They got some help from the state, and they issued $185 million in bonds. So they improved they improved and fixed all their streetlights, and they also converted them to LED. So that's why it looks a different shade than Cleveland's, who were not LED at the time. So I just want to point out what happened. So the street lighting improvements. This is a graphic. It shows pedestrian deaths in Detroit. You can see they're having like almost 50 a year at the height. So the street lighting improvements take place between 2014 and 2016, and you can see sort of what happens as soon as they're done. Pedestrian deaths dropped 35%. They just sort of fell off a cliff in a couple of years, and this is in the context of them rising quite quickly elsewhere. And this graph is hard to read, but this blue portion at the top of all these bar graphs, that's deaths that occurred in dark, unlighted conditions. So they were having like as many as 25 at the height of before they began this project. Those go down to, those are almost completely eliminated overnight. They go from having like 25 to having just one a year after that. So I think it's a big success story. More cities. It's a really good thing for equity, for social equity, and to look at that. And it's also I know some people have some complaints about LED lights, but there's also potentially big environmental and even financial benefits for cities to converting to those. I use Detroit as a good example. I'm interested if there's any implications for your population with this. But one thing that they're doing that's smart, in my opinion, in Detroit is they're adding a bunch of speed humps. They're trying to control speed. Speed is really important for pedestrian safety. Like if you're looking ahead, if someone who's 70 years old is struck by a car at 40 miles per hour, they are almost certain to die. But if you can keep speeds down to 30 or 25, their odds of survival become much, much higher. So controlling speed is really, really critical to reducing these safety problems. So Detroit, I just think this is it's sort of a cheap and dirty way to address this. They're only spending 11.5 million. Detroit is still not a really wealthy city. It's actually, it's a really poor city. A lot of people are reliant on transit and walking, and they have very wide streets. So this is a sort of, I think, a good strategy for controlling speeds. And again, I'd turn it back to you. I'm curious if there's any problems with that. One thing people sometimes recommend in planning is if you have a little bit more money, you can actually do a raised crosswalk. And I know you can do different textures with that I think can be helpful. But that makes it so drivers are having to slow down a little bit. The level change forces drivers to slow down right at intersections where they're most likely to have a conflict with the pedestrian. And it also makes it so people who use wheelchairs do not have to do then a level change. They get to, continue along a straight path. So that also can be a good tool.
I think those are examples of great universal design, because the elevated crosswalks are great for our folks too, because whether you're doing it visually or tactually, it gives you a really nice delineation, and it really prevents people from veering. And I love the idea of adding the speed humps, because that is such an economical way to make a really big impact. And I think it's so nice to see people being very pragmatic and still getting stuff done, even though they can't sink, $1 billion in to completely redesign something.
Right. I know that I should have included, I know that they're trying some of this stuff in Pittsburgh. The Department of Transportation there. Do you want me to pull it up? I don't know that. Okay. When I'm done with this presentation, I will. I'll pull up something that they're doing in Pittsburgh that I think is interesting. I'm curious if you guys will have any response to it from a disability rights perspective.
Oh, I
So
think that would be a great thing to talk about.
okay, cool. So I'm sort of this is how I wrap up my presentation. I use this example. This is called a pedestrian refuge islands, and it's not really a new or very sexy treatment. These have been around for a long time. They're not very expensive. They're recommended by the Federal Highway Administration. They say they help reduce pedestrian collisions about 35%. And I like this one. It's, accessible and landscape. So maybe it's a little more expensive one. So I think we need a lot more little interventions like this. And I think that the reason they've sort of been overlooked is because a lot of people who are more privileged are just not being put in these situations where they're having to cross really wide, dangerous roads. So I think we could talk a lot about what are the design solutions, but in a lot of ways, we've sort of lacked the will to address this problem. And one thing I was hoping to do with writing this book and going around and talking about is sort of raise the profile of the issue, get people thinking about this. And, we have all the design tools at our disposal to address this if we want to. But again, it's sort of, about who benefits and developing the sort of political will for that. So I don't know if you guys have access to my book, but this is just at the end of all my presentations. If you do want to buy it and you want a discount, you can get a discount through the publisher right here by using my last name. And I'll hunt down you get to see my messy desktop. Oh no. And my
While
Twitter.
you're pulling that up, I'll go ahead and announce that if anybody hasn't had a chance to get the book yet and you want to, and price is an object because I know that life gets expensive, especially when you're in school and stuff, just shoot me an email and we would be happy to order you a copy if that is going to be something that you would like, but it's a little bit of a burden for you. Just let me know and we'll get that to you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I might not be able to find it as quickly as I thought. Do we want to, I'll sort of, I don't know if there's any more questions while I'm hunting around for that.
And we don't mean to put you on the spot. We don't have to
No, I would kind of like to show you. People I was sharing it on social media and people were kind of interested in it. I think it's kind of innovative. What they did basically is yes, here it is. I found it. Good. Okay, here I'll share. You guys have sort of I think that Pittsburgh is trying to be pretty progressive about this stuff, and that you're, sorry, now I just have to find, here it is thinking about these kind of things and trying to come up with solutions. So they carved out, again, I ended it with this little spiel, my presentation about pedestrian refuge islands. So basically what they've done in a few places in Pittsburgh is they're trying to use these, cheap temporary materials to create those inexpensively in certain areas. So that's sort of what they look like. There's more. Oh, here's something else they did, a little traffic circle. So then, at an intersection, a car has to slow down and go around it. Obviously, it's all very, again, here, when I was in Pittsburgh, I noticed one of these. So it just gives people, if they can't make it across, this is the one I saw too. If they can't make it all the way across, they have a little bit of a safer place to wait. So yeah, I don't know. I just wondered what you guys, and I think that they've made a real effort because there's another example. They've made a real effort to try and do outreach in underinvested neighborhoods where folks might have a little bit less comfort with interacting with city officials, to try and sort of overcome that and make sure that they're installed in an equitable way, I believe, which is interesting, but that's sort of all I know about it.
Thanks for bringing that up. I would be curious, so folks that are in here, because it's good for you guys to chime in and get involved in this conversation. What are your thoughts on those? Do you think that those are helpful, or do you see any potential barriers with those? What are you thinking? I have thoughts, but you guys listen to me yap all the time.
I think the color of the yellows might like help if they're crossing a street. They can use as like a signifier, like to know they're safe to get across to that area.
Yeah, it's got great contrast. That's important. Really great thought, Katie. Anybody else?
Is this like only specifically if there are sidewalks, or no? Does it not matter? Because I was gonna say it would be difficult if there weren't sidewalks and they had those, but.
I'm not certain. I'm not certain. It might say in this article. I wonder if they do try to use them with curb ramps. I would imagine, but it looks like they're being used sort of at mid-block too.
I
Right.
think that picture, oh yeah, that's Frankstown Avenue in Larimer. But the ones I've seen them as around Oakland. For those of you who are actually in Pittsburgh, a lot of our students are distant, so they're in different places in Pennsylvania or different parts of the country even. But for those of you who are in Pittsburgh, like if you're on Oakland, sort of in that area near Bigelow Boulevard, like where you're going between Bloomfield and Oakland is the only place I've seen them. And they were set up with the sidewalk and the crosswalk. As I'm looking at this, I love some things about them. I love that they've got lots of contrast. Like Katie said, I kind of like the tactile piece. If somebody, you know, that it's raised, if you know what to expect, you know, if this is the type of thing that's installed and you're able to take your student or client and say, look, this has been installed, this is what this is for. I think that's great. I think if this gets installed and you're just walking to work one day and nobody's told you it's there, you're going to think, what the heck? Are there cones in the middle of the street? Is this construction? And they're going to like freak out, turn around and run back to the place where they started. Because I think you could really be incredibly confused by what that is. If all of a sudden there's these little like waist tall posts blocking your way and nobody has ever told you what they are. So I think there would be a learning curve.
I think sometimes too, cities experiment, they use these temporary cheaper materials to experiment with a particular design. And then if they get good feedback from the community, then they try to add it to the capital budget and put in curbs and maybe a tree or something like that. Sometimes something like this would have a bollard, like a concrete bollard or sign in it to prevent drivers from driving right into it, hopefully. But yeah, that might be, it could be that this is sort of phase one. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Just a quick question for students to see if you're thinking about this. Think back to sort of that that nicer one that like had the sort of like landscaping that we were looking at a few minutes ago. What would be a really important key feature that would need for somebody who's crossing tactually to make sure they knew when they had completed the crossing?
Maybe like the domes at the end of the sidewalk, like I forget what they're called, the domes at the end of the sidewalk.
Yeah, you're right on top of it, Katie. Yeah, so the truncated domes, remember, those are always supposed to be parentheses. So you have your opening and your closing. And you know, that little pedestrian safety island is really nice because if you can't make the crossing all in one go, you can, you know, rest there and be safe. But it's really important that it has that opening and closing parenthesis on, you know, in all four chunks of the crossing. So you've got your initial start, your closing parenthesis, your opening, and then your closing, because otherwise our folks might get to that middle part and think, oh, I'm done, and think they're on the sidewalk when they're not.
I'm not familiar with those. That's bad.
Well, it's just the truncated domes. Like they had them. I couldn't tell. It looked like in that picture, it looked like they had 4 of them. The contrast on them wasn't what I would normally like to see. But other than that, it looked like the placement was right.
Yeah, so is there sort of any questions I missed, or am I allowed to ask you guys questions?
You are encouraged to ask them questions.
Sometimes I like to do that. I mean, what it would be interesting for me to know, someone who's working in planning and working on these kind of issues, what you see as sort of the biggest problems that with the built environment and mistakes that planners are making that make it much more difficult for people with low vision.
I think when it comes to stuff like that, the folks in our area that know a lot about vision and the needs of people who are blind and visually impaired don't always do a great job of knowing what you guys are up to. So we don't know the right people to talk to, and we don't know necessarily the right language to use. And that's one reason I'm really glad we can come together tonight, because you guys are going to have more of that. And so you guys will be able to be better advocates, because you're just still at the beginning of your learning process. And I'm doing the same thing. So I think the more that we can come together, you know, for cross-disciplinary collaboration is really important, because I think that's when we're going to get the best outcomes for everyone.
One thing I have a consulting business now, which it's brand new, and I really haven't been involved in a street level sort of design project yet, but I may at some point. One thing I want to encourage cities to do a little bit more is, usually planners think about things in really sort of geographic terms. We're thinking about streets and we're looking at like these maps from above a little bit. And I think it would be helpful to be sort of focusing on specific populations who are a little bit at risk. One of the groups that is killed a lot this way is homeless people. So it's sort of, if we wanted to get a lot of bang for our buck safety wise, it's like, where are homeless people congregating in our cities? Is there something we can do in those areas to boost safety? And I think like institutions that serve blind people really, deserve special sort of attention to the facilities around them. Obviously, you're not going to reach every person that way, but we could be using sort of demographic information to be guiding some of our investments a little bit more than we do, I think.
Yeah, when you mentioned that, just one place around the country that comes to mind is Louisville, Kentucky. I'm originally from Kentucky, and my first real job out of school was working at the American Printing House for the Blind. Those of you who are in the Vision Studies program are very familiar with APH. Those of you who are not probably aren't. They create a lot of products for folks in our field. But the American Printing House for the Blind happens to employ people, a large percentage of people who are blind, not because it's their mission to employ people who are blind, but people who are blind know a lot about Braille, and so they have a lot of content knowledge. And it happens to be next door to a school for the blind. And let me tell you, there are two neighborhoods in all of Louisville, Kentucky that are easily accessible by bus. One is downtown because it's downtown, and the other is this neighborhood where the printing house and the school for the blind are, because it's a neighborhood where people just sort of have naturally congregated, and that's where they live, and that's where the demand is for bus access. So it's really interesting to see that demographic shift just because of that one little pocket of people.
That is cool.
What questions do you guys have? This is a lot of, I think, new information for a lot of you. So you've got to have questions.
So I have a question. Why would any planner think that having the roundabouts, why would that be safer for pedestrians? Because there's always cars coming through the roundabouts. It's not even that safe for the drivers. And I've used them a lot, especially when I visit family in New Hampshire, and they're not the safest things.
You know what? Actually, there really are, for drivers in particular, a lot of safety benefits, because I could pull up something about it, but typical intersections really are not very safe. There's like, I can't remember exactly, but there's like 12 potential conflict points at an intersection. And you can also have like a lot of times we see pretty serious collisions at intersections because you have like sort of high speed T-bone type crashes. Maybe someone races to beat the light, they T-bone somebody. So w- the w- with the roundabout, and that was sort of a neighborhood roundabout, so maybe it's a little bit different. But if all the cars are sort of going in the same direction, then if they hit each other, the force, it's sort of physics. The force of the impact is much, you're getting like a fender bender from behind. It's quite different than a high speed sort of T-boning, or even intersections open up the possibility of a head-on crash, which is really the worst kind. So there really are a lot of safety benefits potential now. Um, they do present safety issues for a lot of people think, they present safety issues for pedestrians. Are they, and I think I may have heard, are they a particular issue for blind pedestrians? I'm not 100% clear.
Yeah, they can be. They like the picture, the one you showed in the picture would actually, from what I could see, be a pretty easy intersection to cross, even though that is there.
Yeah.
Some of them are not set up very well for individuals who are blind and visually impaired. Some of them are not set up well for people who are perfectly typically sighted.
Yeah,
So
you're right that they do have to be really, yeah. I mean, those are both concerns. They have to be really carefully designed.
I think part of the issue too is it's something that's newer in our infrastructure. And a lot of people who are, I would guess, I don't know, maybe 40 and over, they didn't see a lot of these when they were in school. So they weren't necessarily trained in how to approach these. So it's kind of a new travel challenge that people haven't necessarily received training in. I think we can do a better job of it with our students and clients now that it's more common.
Yeah, they actually save a lot of energy as well because so you don't have to spend the time sort of idling at a red light. So some engineers think, I've heard some engineers say it's unethical that we build so many intersections because they're so much less safe compared to roundabouts. So I think we will see more and more of them. The actual town, I grew up in this suburb of Columbus that was sort of like a sprawl suburb. And they've put them right in the center of this suburb I grew up in. Like the couple of the two biggest intersections now have been replaced with roundabouts. And you do see it it's becoming kind of common in the suburbs of Columbus.
We don't tend to have a lot of roundabouts here in Pittsburgh just because of the way the city is set up. Everything is so narrow, there's not space.
Yeah, no, that is, they tend to be like, they seem so large. Yeah. Yeah, and I think sometimes it's more costly, up front. We don't consider unfortunately, we don't consider the costs of like hospitalization for crashes, or energy issues, a lot of times as much on the upfront construction costs as we should. Otherwise, things would be designed a lot differently.
That was a great question, Donna. Thank you so much for bringing up that issue. What other questions do you guys have? Are you guys tired from having a really long day?
It looks like there actually are a couple questions in the that people are just kind of being shy. Someone asked self-driving cars. Yeah, they asked what kind of impact that would have on pedestrian incidents, and they said Uber was using them, and then they heard that they had to intervene quite a bit. That's true. Like I have actually kind of like a whole chapter in my book about that. It was really a woman was killed a couple years ago by an Uber self-driving car, and it was really pretty messed up. That was sort of the PG way of saying it, but the company Uber was being pretty reckless. Their technology was not very good. They were sort of racing to market, and there was a lot of warnings, and that were sort of ignored. And a woman was killed, a homeless woman in Tempe, Arizona, by an Uber self-driving car. And it was a really big deal. And I think like I was just talking with someone who's with the National Disability Rights Coalition, I believe it's called, who was really instrumental apparently in, there was some legislation that was favored by self-driving car companies, and she was very instrumental in striking it down. So I know there's a lot of concerns, like the testing is pretty much completely unregulated. There's no special laws governing how self-driving car companies can operate. At the federal level, it's just sort of like they're expected to police themselves, and they have they can voluntarily report like how many miles they've driven and how many incidents they've had, but there's really no way, nobody's really checking that. So it does raise potentially safety concerns, the testing. But of course, there's the whole issue of the possibility, if we get self-driving cars, you know, the hope is, and one of the big talking points of the self-driving car developers is that they'll be much safer, potentially they say safe enough to eliminate all crashes, or all injury-causing crashes is what they say. But I talked to some people for my book. I was able to talk to like some of the leading experts, including like the guy who is in charge of vehicle safety at Consumer Reports, and he was really skeptical about self-driving cars, and so were some other people I talked to, like car experts. First of all, skeptical that they would happen. There's a lot of, it used to be a few years ago, it was kind of the kind of common thinking was that they were right around the corner. And I think like there's been this real adjustment in the way people think about it, and there's a lot more skepticism about that. So the people I talked to for my book seemed to think it was never going to happen, was their sort of appraisal, or that if it was going to happen, it was in the very distant future. And one thing right now, what we have is right now we do have, I feel like I'm ranting a little bit, but I think this car stuff is really interesting. What we do have now coming on the scene a lot is partially automated features. So like Tesla, I think, is a little unethical in exaggerating the capabilities of their cars as far as self-driving. I think that they sort of stoke a misunderstanding that their cars are self-driving when really they're only partially automated and require pretty constant monitoring, and they're really only meant to be partially automated in a highway environment. But there are a lot of exciting technologies that are coming online that are partially automated in a way. So there's one called automatic emergency braking, which I think would be relevant to your population, where, you know, a lot of new cars, especially higher end new cars, come with this technology called automatic emergency braking, and they have sensors that stop the car from hitting things, and that would include a pedestrian or an object, or potentially another car. And there's a lot of data that shows that does make a big difference, that there's a lot of potential with automatic emergency braking to reduce injuries and deaths. But right now, the federal government, NHTSA, has not required it. They do have a voluntary, apparently there's a voluntary, car companies have made this like gentleman's agreement that they're all gonna add that to their cars, I believe by the model year 2022. So, but there's other technologies too, including there's a technology called pedestrian detection. Have you guys heard of that? Does anyone have a car with pedestrian detection? Have any experience with that? Automatic pedestrian detection?
I've
Mine
heard about it. My car is not that fancy.
Mine doesn't have it's not for pedestrians, but it has the backup camera. And so it'll notify me if someone's walking behind me or if there's a car moving. So when I'm in a parking lot, especially, you know, at a grocery store, or really anywhere. But if I'm at a grocery store, this is where I've noticed it the most. People obviously like to walk really close to your car, and even if you look in your rear view, no one may be there, but then they may come out of nowhere. So mine actually notifies me on either side if people or cars are coming from, like, it's not like the peripheral vision of my car, but that's essentially what it's equivalent.
Yeah. They're surrounded by sensors now. Yeah. And parking lots are kind of dangerous environments, and I'm sure they present a lot of issues for blind folks. But yeah, so there's all these sensors now, right? And those, I am kind of optimistic about that kind of stuff. There's a study I cited in my book, and it found that these Subaru cars that have automatic pedestrian detection, automatic emergency braking, and a couple of other technologies like that again are becoming sort of standard, especially in higher end cars now, that they had a 35% reduction in pedestrian injury claims, insurance claims, so that they were hitting a lot less pedestrians. So I think that's really promising. But the technology is sort of not really up to any standard because it's not been required. The federal government, you know, when I showed that picture of like the lifted Ford F-250, I feel like, okay, NHTSA could say, hey, you know, if your car is this gigantic, if you're driving this like gigantic truck, can we at least require those, which that have these big forward blind zones, you know, that they can't see a child standing right in front of them? Could we at least require those trucks to have automatic pedestrian detection? But so far they haven't required that. So basically what I was told by some safety experts is that they can pretty much call whatever they want pedestrian detection, and it's not really up to any standard. And there's a group called the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, and they tested a bunch of the automatic pedestrian detection systems, and they found that they just weren't working very well at all. That they were sort of, they didn't work at all at night, all the different ones they talked about, and they were not very useful at all over like 25 miles per hour. So so while it's kind of promising, without sort of a government requirement, we're going to be limited in how much progress we see from that, I would say.
I think that's an interesting equity issue too, though, because, you know, you mentioned that this is becoming more standard, especially in high-end cars, and people that can afford high-end cars tend to live in neighborhoods where people have more money. And, you know, a lot of what you've been talking about tonight impacts neighborhoods where people who are more marginalized live. And it's just one more example of how people with money get basically a better infrastructure than other folks do.
Yeah, it's actually it's even worse really than all that. I mean, what you're saying is exactly right, but so even like a standard new car will just be quite a bit safer than an older car.
Mhm.
You in a newer car, you might be, or in an older car, you might be 2 or 3 times more likely to wreck, especially if the maintenance is sort of not 100%, which you know, it's great about maintaining their old car. So not just the safety technologies, well, the safety technologies will make that worse. And in addition, one thing I talk about in the book is, in the United States, we tend to like cast off our older vehicles once we're done with them to developing nations, where they might have a much higher pedestrian population, and they're getting like our really unsafe old beaters. So there are a lot of equity issues with it. And we have richer people driving the market towards these bigger automobiles, towards SUVs and large pickup trucks. Those are sort of, you know, pickup trucks can cost as much as $70,000 now. So relatively wealthy people sort of driving, you know, with kind of luxury taste, driving the auto market towards vehicle designs that kill a lot of low-income people as well.
Mm. Joanna, I noticed you had something to say. Please add.
So I have a 2016, I think, Honda CR-V, which isn't a fancy car by any means, but
Yeah.
it has the braking system.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know what that was until it did it. And I was like, oh, what the heck's going on here? Because it really kind of takes over your car. And apparently I must get close to a lot of cars because the braking system kicks in a lot.
Yeah, they're really sensitive.
It is. And I'm glad it does that, but you really have to know what it, I mean, I really freaked out like the first time it happened. And I had to kind of look at my car directory, directions to see what that was. I do have the camera and I have the lane changing beep that if you go
Yeah.
into the other lane, it beeps, and people are always like, what's that noise? What's that noise? I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm in the wrong lane, no
Yeah.
big deal. Anyways, so I'm kind of glad the little CRV has that.
Honda might be a little more safety, some
Mhm.
foreign automakers. A lot of other countries have higher standards. Like in the United States, we don't require, NHTSA has never had a vehicle safety requirement that was designed to protect pedestrians or cyclists or people or wheelchair users, people
Mm.
outside the vehicle. All the vehicle regulations are just to protect passengers and occupants. But in Europe, they do have some requirements. So the foreign automakers might be a little bit more progressive sometimes.
Well, so my youngest son has low vision. He's visually impaired. And he's 17 and he has a driver's license. It's a restricted license. He's only allowed to drive during the day. Anyways, he learned how to drive with my car because of those safety features. And he really does prefer the backup camera, of course, because of the depth perception issue. He loves the braking system, but really the backup camera is key, but also the lane changer thing. But when he drives to school, he has to use the other car, which doesn't have those features. And I'm always kind of like, because I drive my own car, but I'm always kind of like, so when I'm looking for a car for him now, that is actually like his car, I'm looking for those features, the backup camera, the automatic braking system. And yeah, it's, he's going to have a nicer car than me
Yeah, it gets really
because of those features, but it's definitely going to help him. But it is a struggle. It's a struggle because it was a struggle just getting him a license.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a struggle in itself, but now you have to kind of fit him in the right vehicle to protect him, just because maybe he, the vision limitation is just a little bit, he needs a little bit more safety.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I know it is sad that safety is like this luxury.
Yeah, exactly.
It is,
Yeah.
and they do add to the cost of a car, which is why, the auto companies resist them. However, they were always adding this, really sort of superficial stuff that's very expensive too. It's like the heated steering wheel and seats and the like DVD system for the kids, and like there's a lot of stuff that's that's expensive, that's all about just like appearance. I think that the trend to SUVs is very well, there's other things going on, but a lot of it is sort of about appearance and social signaling. Some of these big pickup trucks, people never haul anything with them, so it does create more expense, but also we've created so much expense that is so, for such trivial reasons too in cars, I think.
Is there any data out there about just distracted driving in general in terms of pedestrian, accidents?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So, so we don't actually know real well. Probably it is contributing, and but it's sort of hard to say how much. We do know that people are distracted a lot when they're driving, and that's really dangerous. That almost everyone that has a smartphone is using it almost every time they drive, and that it's like as dangerous as being drunk. to be messing with your cell phone when you're driving. What's sort of sad is like on a lot of this stuff, we sort of like we're sort of like waiting. Once we have self-driving cars, we could have perfect safety. But there's a lot of technology right now, like we have the technology where cars can recognize, for example, when the driver is distracted, and have some kind of noise, or sort of nudge people. Technology companies, they know if someone is driving and texting, so they could disable that, and we just don't. Like there's a lot of safety technologies that are available that would really save a lot of lives that we just don't use because there just isn't the political will. No one's really pushing for it. Like we could speed limit cars. We have the technology. We could speed limit cars, and they're going to do it in Europe to comply with speed limits if we wanted. And instead, we like speed limit scooters, those little scooters in cities with using like geocaching. And, for cars, there's basically no limit to how fast they can make them. So I don't know if that was a very good explanation, but I do think there really isn't very good data that distracted pedestrians are the problem. And one of the ways we know that is because, like I said, so many fatal pedestrian crashes occur at night. And then a lot of the populations that are most impacted are just not super wired. It's like elderly folks, low income folks. It doesn't mean that it isn't ever occurring, but just a lot of the factors that are common sort of point us in a different direction than pedestrian distraction.
These questions are leading to really good conversations. Who else has something burning?
I could hop in. I was just to build off what you were just saying. I would think it's funny that Apple CarPlay, you're able to like pull up all of the text messages like right on the dock screen of your car. I mean, you could get them to play through audio, but at the same time, like while you're driving, you could have all of your text messages just pop up.
We got a new car recently, and you can watch television while you're driving. I mean, NHTSA is just like, and Tesla is really pushing the boundaries with this kind of stuff. And they have like video games that I think you can play just auto installed while you're driving. Elon Musk is kind of a bad actor on this stuff, I think, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
This conversation makes me want to throw up. The thought of somebody playing a video game makes me physically, while they're driving, makes me physically sick to my stomach.
I know. I was on a Zoom call earlier that a woman was driving doing the Zoom call, and it was interesting. But yeah, those are the kind of things we could prevent really easily. I mean, my car sort of does, but again, I was messing around with it, and I figured out a way where I was able to watch television. My kids have like they can watch something, and it turns out like I can watch the same thing while I'm driving. So that's really, really bad. Yeah. And especially like, you have Tesla. Again, I sort of mentioned, I think Elon Musk is kind of a bad actor. A lot of these tech guys that are really involved in the self-driving car sort of movement have really, really wealthy guys, really big egos, just really don't really sort of scoff at some of the safety stuff. The Uber case was really like, I get into a bunch of detail in my book, and it's really, it sort of, once you know the details, it makes you sort of angry what they did and how sort of callous they were about people's safety. But like I said, I think Elon Musk and Tesla, they've sort of exaggerated the capabilities of their cars. Really, they have to be monitored You're not supposed to leave your hands off the wheel, I believe, for more than 90 seconds. And, you know, we've had a number of self-driving car deaths, or I'm sorry, Tesla deaths. They're really not self-driving cars. That's kind of the problem, where people are, you know, not engaging with their steering wheel at all for like 6 minutes and then crashing at an extremely high speed into the back of a fire truck and dying, and that kind of thing is the kind of thing we've seen. And there's sort of like this hero worship of him, where I don't think a lot of like his big fans, you know, apply much scrutiny to the stuff he's saying, and the regulators have not been willing to crack down at all. In Germany, like they call their system, which is in Tesla's system, is it's just a package of partially automated features that are actually becoming sort of standard in higher end cars. Like a lot of people think that Cadillac, they call their system Super Cruise, which is more accurate description, is better than Honda's autopilot. But yeah, in Germany, the safety agency told Tesla they could not use the term autopilot to describe their system because it was misleading and dangerous. But nobody's done that here.
I guess sort of to wind down, unless other people have things to keep asking, which if you do, please wave a hand or start speaking. I just thought sort of to wind down, a really good question for you, Angie, might be if you could share some wisdom with the folks that are listening to your words of wisdom about how they can get involved in ways that will, I don't necessarily want to say activism, but yeah, to be advocates for, you know, safer ways for pedestrians to go about their lives, whether those pedestrians are blind and visually impaired or not, because this is a universal issue of equity for a lot of people. So how can they get involved and start having a voice in bettering our situations?
Yeah, I think planning has not done a good enough job involving people with disabilities, and that it's a really important stakeholder group that I would love to see more active in some of these discussions. A lot of people, like I was sort of come from advocacy, and this stuff is really, really hard. You know, regular people who lose loved ones on certain streets oftentimes are not able to secure even the most minimal, like amenities like crosswalks, like painted crosswalks. So it's really tough, but I think we're at a turning point where things are going to start to change, and we're going to be able to pick up a little bit of speed. I would expect that the new administration, Pete Buttigieg, has sort of put in place what looks to me like a pretty progressive sort of list of undersecretaries. So it's a good question, where and how to get engaged. Sometimes there's biking and walking advocacy groups. I know that you have one in Pittsburgh that's really active on these kind of things. And I think would be great if, I don't know how good of a job they do with outreach and if they're sensitive enough, and maybe they're not, which I think is a problem for some of these groups, but it would be great to form better connections between disability rights advocates and the people that are advocating for safer streets. Because I do think, you know, we could sort of accomplish more together, and that also that it's the right thing to do for the planning community to be sort of part of advocating for safer conditions for people who have disabilities.
Cool. Well, sort of on that note, does anybody have a last minute, just burning comment or question or thought that you're just dying to throw out at us? Going once, going twice, going 2.5 times. Okay, we're sold. Okay, well, everybody give a giant round of applause We are thrilled that we could host Angie tonight, and we really, really appreciate you providing this perspective that we don't always pay as much attention to as we should. So we really appreciate your time this evening to
Yeah, thank
help
you so much. I
give
learned
us
a
some
lot from
knowledge.
this. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's really important what you guys are doing. So we have a long way to go, I think.
We all do, but we're in it together. And I think, once again, just the more we can learn about what other people who have similar interests are doing and some similar goals, we can really get a lot more accomplished. So, you know, we'll each keep cracking away to learn as much as we can and to help others learn as much as they can, because I really think education is sort of at the heart of making progress.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, if we could change the way we think about this stuff a little bit, that's half the battle, I think.
Okay, so I am.
Once again, everyone,